Hi, everybody. It's week 11. Um, and this week, I want to wrap up talking about the administrative state part two and talk about this thing that we call a science of administration that Gulick had talked about, that Wilson had talked about, and some of the critiques of that. And then talk about how all of this leads to what we call the administrative state. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this lecture because I want you to read the materials. And I want to give you time to look at a couple other things. One is I posted a video from the National Constitution Center, and it's fairly recent, actually. This was recorded, this lecture was recorded in January of this year. And what it talks about started minute 43, actually, when you go ahead and click on it, start at minute 43. What the two scholars, law professors, are talking about is really the validity, if you will, the legitimacy of the administrative state, or what we call the administrative state. The administrative state is something that has come under a lot of fire recently. Steve Bannon, who worked for President Trump, is quoted as saying that his goal was to take down the administrative state. A lot of people running for office at various levels have decried the administrative state. But what is the administrative state? Really, it's a term that was pretty much coined by Waldo, and you read a little bit of what Waldo had to say in this week's reading. But what was Waldo really talking about? One of the hallmarks of the administrative state is the idea that government has come to involve itself in the lives of people, and government has come to involve itself in our economy through regulation, through a lot of laws, through a lot of what some people consider government coercion. So the question is this good or is this bad? If those are the only two kind of choices we have, good or bad. And I don't really want to answer that question. I want to leave it up to you to think through that question. So I want to give you time to look at those readings this week. And in this lecture, I just really want to supplement a little bit of the reading so that you can have time to look at those sources. The last source I really want you to look at is optional. I listed it as optional. It talks about administrative procedures, the rule-making process in government. I'll have a little more to say about the rule-making process at the end of this lecture. So let's just progress a little bit. Okay, so Simon in 1946 was critical of Gulick. We talked about Gulick, and Gulick really strongly believed that the executive in government should be the most important branch and the most effective branch, but he also believed really that organizations, administrative organizations, really made the difference. And he came up with what he deemed as some rules of administration. And if those rules were followed, then administrative organizations should be able really to be effective in whatever it is they're doing. Well, Simon actually called what Gulick had written proverbs. He didn't mean proverbs in necessarily a complimentary way. What he was just saying was that they were common sense, feel-good rules that really weren't necessarily able to be demonstrated empirically. He said that there were these proverbs of administration that Gulick had come up with, that there are four of them. Administrative efficiency is increased by task specialization. Administrative efficiency is increased by use of hierarchical authority. Administrative efficiency is increased by limited span of control, and administrative efficiency is increased by organizing workers according to purpose, process, clientele, or place. And so the overriding theme of these proverbs is efficiency. And so what he was saying was Gulick contended that the the primary value of organization was efficiency. And he didn't necessarily agree that that was the primary value of organizations. Rather, Simon criticized some of these proverbs, if you will, that Gulick had posited, because he said they really weren't principles. So instead of arguing that these were principles of administration, they were proverbs. So he said specialization really isn't a principle. It just simply means that different persons are doing different things. The real problem is how to specialize. He said that unity in command is typically not achieved. What he really said was that in most organizations, there is at least dual supervision because workers, they have functional guidance and they have command guidance, and those are from different supervisors. Meaning if you are, for example, an accountant, you may have professional guidance that tells you the rules of accounting, but you also have a boss in the organization that tells you what to do. He said span of control is often contextual and situational, that there's not a magic number. He said that organizing by purpose, process, client, or place, it's not a principle. It really doesn't tell you which is preferable in different contexts. And the same organization could be using all of these principles. But he said, overall, the principles really, or the proverbs as he called them, could be salvaged. How was that? What Simon wanted us to think about in this reading, and think about this as you're reading what he wrote, is this thing called the administrative situation. So what he's really getting at is this idea that we can actually analyze the problem first and not the organization. So this is important. This is an important shift in public administration thinking. Instead of first setting up the organization, as Gulick would have us do, and then going about solving problems, Simon said we should think about the problem first and then organize appropriately. And so what he said was that the real issue in organizations was how do we make decisions given the particular problems that we're facing? And in order to make decisions, Simon said the other thing that we have to consider about organizations and about people is that people are not necessarily fully rational. So we have to consider the members of the organization as being limited in their rationality. And so within the organization, there are limits on the speed of decision making, and there are limits on the knowledge of decision makers. And so how do we make decisions in the organization is really a key element to Simon, more than how do we structure the hierarchy. Another thing I had to read this week is Dahl. Dahl critiqued the administrative management philosophy of Gulick in other ways. He critiqued Gulick basically by saying Gulick was talking about principles of administration, and Dahl says that it's impossible to separate these principles as if they're neutral from really normative values. And so what Dahl was saying about public administration is that we can't separate our normative values from administration. So is efficiency really the most important goal? What about democratic process? Can administrators truly focus on only the means, or do they have to focus on the ends of policy as well? He also asked whether humans can actually behave totally rationally, and whether, again, can they separate their values from the decisions that they're making in the organization. So that's really kind of Dahl in a nutshell. I want you to read what Dahl had to say, but think about these questions he asked as you read it. I'm sorry, I guess I did have one more slide. So what Dahl is saying is that even though Gulick had said there are principles of administration and implied at least that they were universal. Dahl is saying that they're really not universal. This is actually admittedly one of the problems with studying public administration. Public administration was not certainly invented in the United States. For as long as people have tried to do things in groups, there has to have been some kind of administrative process. And so really what Dahl is asking us to do is think contextually when we think about administration and whether there's some universal science of administration. This is really the important thing I want you to read this week. Simon and Dahl are important. Waldo is important because Waldo is credited anyway with coming up with the name the administrative state and making it stick. I mean, this was the name of his book in 1948, The Administrative State. The book has been praised and the book has been criticized. But really, what at the outset, the important thing to realize about the context in which Waldo was writing is that he was writing post-World War II. You know, somewhere, depending on the estimates you read, somewhere between 80 and 100 million plus people perished in the years of World War I and World War II in that roughly 30-year time span. Through wars, through the Holocaust, through purges, in excess probably of 100 million people perished. The United States emerged from World War II really as the most powerful nation on earth. The United States and other nations took it upon themselves to try to bring order to the chaos. This is the context in which Waldo was writing. He says we're striving for a great society, meaning we want to end what we've been doing to each other. And so he says where we're at now, the place we're at right now is that we can develop this rational order called the administrative state. So he says with the closing of the frontier, we see these mega trends happening, if you will. The changes in the business civilization, the modern corporation, the coming of urbanization, our constitutional system, a second phase of the Industrial Revolution, and then moving out of the period of depression and wars to prosperity. And so in the administrative state, Waldo organizes this way. He talks about an ideological framework, and these are the chapters I have you read. The ideological framework in chapter 1. He talks about democracy and the mission of America. He talks about progress, and he talks about a faith in science. And then in chapter 6, which might be controversial, he talks about this ideal person he calls the administrative man. And he's talking about this person with physical and intellectual stamina, this person who is educated, a person who is concerned with human relations and human values, committed to democratic values, and appropriately recruited and trained. So really, if you think about this sounds a lot like trying to fulfill the dream of Woodrow Wilson and what he was writing about back in the 1800s, in the 1880s. So in chapter 7, another really important chapter in this book, The Administrative State, Waldo talks about the 5 powers of government. So note, it's 5, according to Waldo. It's not just 3. We think of the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Waldo talks about, in chapter 7, the 5 powers of government being the executive, the legislative, the judicial, as well as the administrative and the electoral. So this is interesting because we have been discussing whether administration was a legitimate part of government and how we legitimize administration under the Constitution. Waldo says, well, yes, of course it's legitimate because it is a power of government. Government must administratively carry out the laws that it passes. But the electoral power is also important. And so we know that electoral politics and just the act of getting elected is an important part of our governmental structure. It's talked about in the Constitution, but it seems to be part of the other three branches of government. But in fact, Waldo breaks it out. So in Waldo's mind, administration and politics can't be separated. Only certain aspects of politics can be removed. For example, electoral politics. And so in his mind, the administrative man, the executive, is an integrator, basically, of policy and administration. And so then he concludes with this talk of present tendencies, that the future of administration depends on what happens in the world at large. So again, in context, Waldo is writing really basically in the embers and ashes of a world that had really set itself on fire for two really horrific wars. And so he's saying, what's going to happen next? I don't know. But administrators must be committed to democracy, and they must have a strong working relationship with all knowledge, which is something that Dahl was also talking about, that administrators can't just think about pos de corb. They have to have a working relationship with all knowledge. And so all this leads up to the Unit 3 journal. And this is something I want you to think through. The question is that second paragraph there. And right now you might stare at that and say, yeah, I really can't answer that question. Though I've seen your journals and I'm pretty sure you can answer the question. I do want you to think about everything we've read up to this point, from Wilson on, from the Constitution on. Think about the world we live in and the administrative state as you know it, and think about how we got here and where we're going. That's really the point of this journal this week, where we've been with the administrative state and where we're going. So spend some time writing to that. There's no discussion this week. I want you to spend time on this journal and really think through this idea, this notion of the administrative state. So I did promise you I wanted to say a little bit more about administrative rulemaking. I posted some readings. They're optional for you, but I'd like you to take a look at them, and here's why. I am not here to advocate an abundance of government regulations and rules. I will just say this, if you read those readings, here's the point that you should take from this. The administrative rulemaking process, especially at the federal government level, is not arbitrary, and it's not something invented by bureaucrats. Rules aren't made in secret in the middle of the night. They are made by a process that has been passed into law by Congress. So when you look at those optional readings, think about what's the meaning of administrative rules and how can we do better, really. But really think about administrative rules as an idea of the administrative state. And again, I'm not advocating more rules. I'm not advocating fewer rules. I simply want to make sure you get the point that the rulemaking process itself is not some arbitrary process that assigns rules that people can't really keep track of. So with that, I will end my talk and ask you to do these readings and watch the video from the National Constitution Center. And I think you'll have a much better feel for what it is we mean by the administrative state at the end of all of that. Thank you.